Dr. Todd Pressman, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Well, it's good to have this opportunity to speak with you and to meet you because I see we have a lot in common in terms of our humanistic roots and other things. And we've been kind of reviewing some of that off camera. So it's an honor.
Thank you very much. Ditto.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing your 2019 book, Deconstructing Anxiety, The Journey from Fear to Fulfillment, which is an interesting topic, interesting title. What's the story behind this book?
Well, that's my life story, I suppose. This book is the culmination of a whole bunch of adventures and perhaps misadventures in terms of my own journey of discovery. I suppose it began, or one of the starting points might have been that I was born to a father who was a psychoanalyst and a mother who was a social worker.
Oh, well, you come by all this honestly, I guess.
And yet, in my adolescence, I began asking all the good adolescent questions about meaning and purpose and why are we here? Which
Good
set,
for you.
yeah, well, we got to go through that phase, I suppose. And
Yeah.
for me, it became first a philosophical search and then a spiritual slash psychological search. I eventually grounded the spiritual work in hardcore psychology so that I could really make it work in my life and in later my patients' lives. And my father, again, was sort of at the vanguard of that, studying a lot of esoteric and Eastern literature. And I followed in his footsteps and eventually married the spiritual with the psychological, as I said, which is what you find in the book.
Yeah, that's great. And I identify with your father. I suspect we are of about the same generation. And so there were a lot of us young psychologists and psychologist wannabes during a certain period there who were looking to kind of do what you've been able to do, um, trying to bring East and West together and reconcile what was in books with our own personal lives and
Right.
experiences.
Right.
I'm still trying to do that.
My father must certainly have been ahead of you in terms of generation. He was a students of Freud. So he learned from Berta Borenstein and um, uh, some of the other names are escaping me right now, but he would
Okay.
tell very interesting stories that he learned from them about what it was like
Wow.
learning from Freud himself.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's a good heritage to have. So, anything, I guess that's a good summary of what's behind the book. Um, you start with three postulates. Just the use of the word postulates is interesting to me. It seems to suggest that you're really determined to create an unassailable argument.
Hmm.
That could be my projection. I don't know.
No, I think that's well said, and an unassailable argument about the possibility for a transcendent truth, which is
Uh-huh.
written into the postulates. So, if I may review the postulate one
Please do.
says
Yeah.
there is this possibility of a transcendent truth that's characterized by a sense of wholeness, completion, and fulfillment, most of all. Postulate two says that fear, aka anxiety, and I can explain why I use those words interchangeably, is the only obstacle to that truth. And that postulate three, deconstructing anxiety, really getting down to the very essence of it and the fundamentals of it, can pave the way back to the transcendent truth, remove the obstacles, and find our way back to this fulfillment and truth that we're talking about.
Well, that's great. I know that a lot of people who are fans of this show or listeners, viewers, suffer from anxiety because sometimes they've written and said as much. And so you would think anxiety on the one hand sounds like it should be simple. And I remember as a student that, yes, there was a, a connection between anxiety and fear. You kind of equate them. What I learned back when I was in school was that anxiety was a non-specific fear, where that fear typically we know what we're afraid of something specific, but that sort of what they call free-floating anxiety is a variant of fear. As I was trying to prepare for this interview, I was trying to challenge that in my mind, or just wondered, well, that's what was handed down to us. Is that really true? I didn't go very far with that speculation, but I'm just putting it out there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can recognize that kind of distinction in the popular culture, but the DSM says fear is in response to an immediate threat.
Mhm.
Anxiety is about a projection into the future. And
Okay.
I think that distinction is kind of arbitrary, at least the way we use the words in common language. But even if we go with that distinction, the reason I equate the two is because fear being an immediate threat, anxiety being about the future, anxiety creates the same internal response as fear. If we have a thought about the future that makes us anxious, we're still having the same experience internally as if it were happening now.
Yeah, I
And
was wondering if the same brain centers are activated. That's something that we couldn't have asked some years back, but that's a reasonable question in terms of today's science, right?
it's a very interesting thought, and I am convinced myself that if they were able to do such research, they would find absolutely the same brain centers, the same physiological responses are activated. And perhaps sometimes it's a matter of degree. If fear is about an immediate threat, maybe the symptoms are stronger, but you can't say that because if someone's having a panic attack about something in the
Yeah,
future, it doesn't get stronger than that.
right, right. Okay. Well, I don't want us to get hung up on on that. Um, so your book equates anxiety with fear and suggests that fear is at the root of all suffering. And I have to say, from some of my own worst moments, um, I have, I don't know if you've ever heard there's a story, I think it's attributed to William James, where I think a woman came up after a talk that he gave, and she said something about the earth. Her faith is that the earth is supported by an elephant.
Mm,
And,
yes.
and he says, well, what is the elephant standing on? And she says, it's elephants all the way down. I have this picture in my mind of, receding elephants going off into infinity down below. I've had some experiences where that seemed to be fear, that I just, it looked like it was fear all the way down at the very root of my psyche, which is troubling. So I think this will be an important conversation for me.
Well, that's quite a metaphor and very useful for something that I believe we'll talk about a bit later. There is a way to trace step by step, as if you're looking elephant by elephant,
Yeah.
any particular problem. And I mean it when I say it's the root of all suffering. So you can take any problem, big, small, related to what you think it's about, not related, and trace it down step by step with a process that I talk about in the book to find the original, or what I call the core fear that started the whole thing.
Hmm.
And then, since we're on the subject, this is extremely important because that core fear is at the root of uh, the original problem you start with. You can discover with this same process, it's at the root of any problem you can imagine in your life. How we as individuals respond to problems is always going to be determined first and foremost by that core fear.
Shall we name it or just put that off?
Shall we name the core fear?
Yeah.
Oh,
Or
okay. No,
question.
certainly. There is not one. In fact, there could be said to be an infinite variety, but I have found in working with clients or patients over the years with this process that there really are 5 broad categories of core fears.
Hmm.
And everybody's experience can be fit pretty nicely into one of these 5. And the 5 are: first, fear of abandonment; second, loss of identity. Who am I? Third, loss of meaning. what's my worth and what's the worth or value of this existence in this world. Fourth is loss of purpose, which is different from meaning. It's about expression and movement toward our goals for improving our lives, for making the world a better place. Fifth is the fear of death, and that includes the fear of pain and sickness, which of course are very common fears as well.
Yeah, well, those are all heavy duty, and I'm trying to to absorb them and live with them right now. And certainly the fear of death, I can identify with. At times, it's there are times when I could say, well, I'm not afraid of death, and feel like I could go soon, and it wouldn't be that big a deal. Um, but I think that's easy to say. It's even easy maybe to kind of sort of believe it. But I have a feeling that in extremis, I might not feel the same. I don't know.
Into this world very attached to our individual identity, and loss of identity is one core fear, but of course death takes care of all the rest. If we
Yeah,
lose our chance for love, as in the fear of abandonment, we lose our chance for our identity, our meaning, our purpose, until, and here's the good news, we
okay.
resolve these anxieties, these fears. And resolution of the fear of death means that it is possible to have a true acceptance of death, and perhaps, if this is in one's belief system, what comes afterwards, or if it's more about sort of disappearing into the universe, to come to an acceptance of that, which can make a profound difference in a person's life.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's move along. I think I jumped you ahead a bit. Um, where do you want to go from here? Well, one thing I want to note is that you did spend, this isn't all just from reading books and so on, you actually spent a considerable amount of time in the Far East. You studied with some spiritual teachers. Yeah, tell us about that. And I wonder, was it tough for you to integrate that with all your other experience?
As I gave you a little bit about my biography, the spiritual quest came first, and then I grounded it in psychology. So the challenge was to ground it. And again, I was motivated by an intense desire, which I still have, to make this work in people's lives and my own. So if it was kind of spiritual philosophy, or just sort of meditate on higher images of things, that wasn't going to satisfy me. I wanted to have concrete tools for
Mm-hmm.
digging up the source of my conflict, whatever form it might have taken, and really discovering this transcendent truth we were talking about earlier. So I think that, yeah, it's fair to say I come by this honestly. I have lived everything I'm talking about. I studied with a great variety of wonderful teachers, Eastern and Western, traditional psychological approaches, alternative consciousness approaches, and so forth. And the amalgam is what you see in the book.
Yeah, yeah. So now, obviously, we're sort of hardwired with fear, right?
Yeah.
Basic in our basic nervous system, and what neuroscience has been telling us is that we also seem to be neurologically skewed somewhat in the direction of the negative rather than the positive. That it's easier for us to sink down into fear, depression, etc., than to float up into bliss, unless we're blessed somehow with a different kind of disposition.
It's a very important question, and I am going to take a rather controversial view.
Okay.
Uh, the controversial statement, if I put it right out there, is that I believe consciousness uh, informs and shapes our physiology, even. Um, and another way of saying that is form follows function. So we have genes that seem to be set and we can't have any control over, and yet we know that there are ways of turning on and off those genes, even with psychotherapy. But if I take it to its extreme, I believe that we are having a perceptual projection in what we call our experience of the world. And everything starts with the thoughts that give rise to that perceptual projection. I like to say the world is like a three-dimensional, multi-sensory hologram that we're living inside of. It's three-dimensional, it's multi-sensory, it feels, tastes, sounds, looks, and so forth, very, very real and solid. But some of the mystical experience, mystical stories you hear, and even more ordinary, everyday kinds of alterations in consciousness show that that solid world out there may not be so solid and is transformable according to our perception. So there's an important chapter in the book on perception and how we can alter it, and how the way to alter it is by resolving the fear that creates the perception of an anxious world, paving the way to that more transcendent, higher, fulfilling perspective.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a little distracted because my earbuds here have conked out a little bit, and I'm hearing my own voice differently than I was. But fortunately, you're still coming through here on the left side only, and I may have to scurry about and find some alternate headphones or something.
We were talking about perception.
Yeah, really, really, really. Okay, so yeah, so I have some familiarity and acceptance of that metaphysical worldview that which you've just explained, I think, better than I can. So I'm not totally resistant to it. I'm not always in touch with it, though.
Well, none of us are, and because the perception that we're usually using to interact with the world is based on this core fear, I can explain that. We are not usually in touch with the possibility of transcendence, but that's one of my sort of passions and missions to get the word out there. It can be altered, and freedom from this kind of anxiety and anxious perception is very possible.
Your book, in fact, has two parts, and one part of it is very practical. The second part of it is practical in the sense of you give practices, you spell out practices and exercises that are designed to help people work through the fear and suffering that they have. So feel free to shuttle back and forth in whatever way makes sense to you.
Okay. Well, if you're asking for some explanation about the exercises, that is new territory from what we've been talking about. I'm happy to go there if you want to dig in.
It's your call. I want you to go where you want to with this discussion.
Well, let's start with this. Before we would talk about exercises for freedom from fear or resolution of fear, we have to talk about the exercises in the book for discovering one's core fear, which I referred to earlier, and also for discovering what I call the chief defense. You can see my psychoanalytic background there. And the chief defense is a primary overriding strategy for protecting oneself from the core fear. So, of course, any defense is designed to protect from a fear. The chief defense is the granddaddy that's designed to protect us from the grandmother of fears, the core fear. And the exercise for finding the core fear is really the cornerstone of this deconstructing anxiety model, is what we were talking about earlier with the elephants. So I'll lay it out for you. It's actually simple to describe. It takes a little bit of finesse and training to implement. But we start out with a problem. And again, it's important to state it can be any problem. They will all come down through this process to the discovery of one's core fear. And in response to that problem, we are asked one of three questions. The questions are, why is that upsetting to you? Number two, what are you afraid would happen next? And number three, what are you afraid you would miss or lose? These are all variations on a simple question, which is, we have that original problem at the top. Let's go one level deeper to find the fear underneath that. And you find the fear by asking, why is that upsetting to you? Or what are you afraid would happen next? Or what are you afraid you would miss or lose? This, by the way, doesn't sound too different from David Burns's vertical arrow technique. And Albert Ellis had something called chaining. But the distinction is we're looking for a core fear. So we have to continue the process all the way down until you have what you are certain, and I'll tell you how we do that, is your core fear, that there's nothing more fundamental, that this is the description of what infuses all of your experience of life when you're fearful. So again, we start with the one problem. We ask, why is that upsetting to you, or one of the other questions, and get an answer that's one level deeper. Here's an example. My boss called me in for a meeting later in his office. Why is that upsetting to you? Underneath that, I'm afraid he might be saying something that will be problematic. And then you can ask the question, what are you afraid would happen next? Meaning, if it is problematic, what are you afraid would happen next? And the answer might be something like, I might get fired. And you keep asking one of the three questions to each answer, every time taking one step down closer to the core fear, where we might use your analogy and say one elephant lower in the chain.
Yeah. Now I've got to interrupt you. My hearing devices have conked out, and past experience suggests that there is a danger that your voice is going to go into this microphone, and it's going to be very echoey. Okay. So I'll ask your forbearance while I figure out some kind of alternate solution. Okay, so let me back you up, because you were giving this great example.
Right.
And I apologize.
No problem. You want me to jump back in?
Sure.
Okay.
Yep, I can hear you, and I know there's not going to be an echo, so that's okay. Great.
So we were saying there's a process for finding one's core fear that involves stating any problem at the top of a page, and then asking one of our three questions. Why is that upsetting to you? What are you afraid will happen next? Or what are you afraid you would miss or lose? The answer to that question becomes a new answer, a new problem, one level deeper or one level closer to the core. So we write it underneath the first problem, and then ask one of the three questions of that problem on the right side of the page if you're writing this down.
Yeah. Yeah. And
continue down until you get to the core fear. So I was giving the example of someone whose initial problem is, my boss is asking me to come into his office later in the day. Why is that upsetting to you? The answer is, I might be getting into some sort of trouble. If you're getting into trouble, what are you afraid will happen next? The answer might be, I could lose my job.
Exactly.
You continue on. If you lose your job, what are you afraid might happen next? I could be out on the streets.
Yeah.
And at that point, excuse me, we don't want to guess what a, thank you. If only we could send that like in Star Trek over the internet. At that point, we don't want to guess what the patient or client's core fear might be. If we do, and say, if they're out on the streets, their core fear might be a fear of death, right? Obvious connection. If I'm homeless, if I don't have shelter, I could be exposed to the elements and die, or something like that. But if we assume that, we as therapists, then we're actually projecting our own core fear onto them, because they might say something completely different according to their history that led to their core fear. For instance, and this is a true story with a client of mine, if I am out on the street, what am I afraid will happen next? I'm afraid that my peers and colleagues will look down upon me. I'll lose the respect of my peers and colleagues. Then I asked, if that were true, what are you afraid will happen next? And he said various things, which led to a core fear of losing his identity. And I knew his background. He had grown up with a severely critical father, and he could never be good enough for his father. So that his chief defense, his protection against that core fear, was to be extremely productive and responsible, and present himself as a person who would be very successful in life. If he lost his job and were out on the street, he would lose all of that. So his answer was very different from someone else who might have a fear of death, or somebody else who might have a fear of abandonment. If I'm on the streets, all of my friends and loved ones will leave me because they're not going to approve of me, and so forth. Any of the 5 core fears are possible, but we want to go down all the way to the bottom of this ladder, where every time you ask one of the 3 questions, you come up with the same answer. Usually you also know you're at the core fear because there's a powerful kind of emotional response and a recognition of this answer, this core fear, really explaining so much of one's life history and the decisions they made and how they ended up where they are, and so forth.
Yeah. Now I get a little confused between the 5 core fears and the core fear. Are we at the bottom?
Sure.
There's
Everybody
one.
has one core fear out of the 5. And frankly, we all have all 5, but
Okay.
there's one that's predominant in each of our individual history. And that predominant core fear is what informs our perception of the world.
Oh, I see. So there's not just one universal core fear, but everybody's going to have all 5, and one of them is going to be more salient.
Much more salient.
Yeah. Okay.
So if I continue on from there about the exercises, the next exercise is how to find one's chief defense, which again is defined as a primary strategy, an overriding strategy for protecting oneself from the core fear.
Right.
That example I was giving a moment ago, my patient who had a very severe father and learned to be afraid of losing his identity as someone who was upstanding and worthy of approval, developed a chief defense, as I was saying, of being extremely productive, always busy. Actually, and a lot of your listeners will recognize this in their clients, he was the kind of guy that needed to create problems to manage, or crises even, so that he could unconsciously, I suppose, satisfy the demands of his father, or whatever that internal imago would be, and prove his worth, keep his identity strong. Of course, like any good defense, the chief defense backfires. It's supposed to make us relieved of fear, but it may do so for the moment. That's why we keep repeating it. But overall, it promulgates fear. It tells us I'm defending against something that's real. It must truly be awful, or I wouldn't be devoting my life to trying to protect myself from it. And so we're constantly keeping the fear in mind, constantly filling our minds with thoughts of, what's next coming down the pike that I have to be prepared to use my defense with.
Yeah, that was one of the kind of more shocking statements in the book, is that none of our fears are real. I think you've just explained that, but say it again.
Qualify it. None of them are real in the sense that they will never play out the way our fear says they will. At most, we'll find a manageable problem to deal with, and one problem at a time. Usually we find it was completely made up from, again, childhood learnings that created a distorted perception. But one of my favorite quotes by Michel de Montaigne says, my life was filled with terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened.
Yeah. And I can identify with that. I mean, I think of all the things that I've worried about, been anxious about, not getting through school, not graduating, not finding a job, not being able to support a family. I've been through all of those, and but that's not how it's turned out.
Yeah.
Happily.
Even if one's greatest fear comes true, Uh, and again, we see this with people who are dying, for instance, unless it's a surprise sudden death and if they have some time to prepare for it, there's some kind of acceptance, or let's say lack of resistance, that takes over inevitably. It's impossible to move through one's fear and not lose your fear of it, because you see it didn't have the power to carry out the threat in the way it was promising. So when we live through it, even in our imaginations, and we know this from exposure therapy, we find it wasn't so awful. Manageable problem at worst. Usually, again, most of our fears are made up completely.
Yeah. What about, I hear hints of cognitive behavioral therapy here. You mentioned exposure therapy. Um, most of our fears are overblown, but how should we deal with fears that rationally we recognize are unrealistic? So,
How do we come to an awareness that they're unrealistic?
no, not that. We may reach awareness of they're unrealistic, and yet we're still obsessive compulsive, let's say, uh, even though we know that, oh, this is really unrealistic for me to be
Right.
washing my hands constantly and to ward something off.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah,
I guess I'm asking, at the emotional level, how do we get out of our head totally and into the emotional level of resolving this stuff?
right. The general answer I would offer is that any successful treatment of anxiety requires not just insight. We can have all the insight in the world about how irrational and unreal it is, but action, corrective action that again involves some form of exposure that proves to us in our experience, our lived experience, the fear doesn't have the power to carry out its threat. And then if we look at insight as from on the level of the mind, and action is the level of the body, I like to add that if you have a spiritual perspective, and yes, I'm very much a holistic or transpersonal guy,
Mm-hmm.
then we put those insights and actions in the higher context of what a spiritual perspective offers. So action is sometimes an instantaneous kind of thing that can even happen in our thoughts. If an insight is true enough, there's an action involved that says, I am looking at this fear, facing it in my mind, and discovering it's not real. That automatically leads to a grander spiritual perspective, because, hey, I'm not this small, vulnerable figure I thought I was. I am something bigger that can stand up to what was previously so threatening.
Yeah.
So we need the right combination of mind, body, spirit, or insight, action, and that spiritual context. But there's another answer. The techniques for resolving anxiety are many and varied, but I believe if you really understand your core fear and chief defense, then the most successful resolution of anxiety means doing the opposite or bypassing the chief defense. So you've got your fear and then you've got your defense, which is like a lid on it. Lift that lid off, expose yourself to that fear, that's the action component, and discover that it doesn't have the power to hurt you. If you're exposing yourself to the core fear, having removed the chief defense, that's at the root level. There's no deeper level to go. So you have a resolution of the anxiety that's giving rise to the entirety of your struggles.
Mm-hmm. I've been very intrigued by the renaissance in psychedelics that's going on right now. And just to kind of come from another direction here, and where does that fit in what we're talking about here? Because people have profound spiritual experiences that some people do, many people do, as a result of plant substances, what are called plant medicines, and as well as very frightening experiences and hellish experiences. So I just kind of want to throw that into the mix here.
Sure.
Since you're a holistic guy, you got to do the whole thing.
I have some answers for you from my from my perspective, I actually studied with Stanislav Grof.
Oh, good. Yeah. I've interviewed him as well. Yeah.
He's one of my few and true mentors in life. Great, great.
Uh-huh.
And as you may or may not know, or your listeners may or may not know, he started his work in the States and in Czechoslovakia by doing LSD psychotherapy.
Right.
And this was at the beginning of the arrival of LSD, and it hadn't received all the bad press that it has since then. And it was looked at as something extremely promising for people suffering from anything from schizophrenia to terminal illness. And I saw some videos that Stan showed at his trainings of people, a couple of people who were facing death and underwent his LSD psychotherapy protocol and had just remarkably transformative experiences, spiritual experiences, if you want to use that word. He since has developed a technique called holotropic breathwork, which doesn't involve any drugs, so we don't have to worry about any of the potential hazards of that. And it has the capacity also to powerfully expand one's consciousness to awareness of vastly, again, expanded dimensions of who we are and what's possible in reality. And Stan's whole work is about the therapeutic potential of these things. I actually did my dissertation on the therapeutic potential of his work.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
Yeah,
That we got there. Yeah.
and it's very provocative because no question, essentially everybody that goes through this holotropic breathwork has a profound experience, often life-changing. So I would call that, if we were talking earlier about mind, body, and spirit, or what I call approaches that enter the doorway of the mind or the body or the spirit, this would be a doorway of the spirit kind of approach. And as we were saying earlier, you can in a moment look at your fear or resistances and conflicts and put them in this huge spiritual perspective that the holotropic breathwork provides, and the fears will just get swallowed up and immediately vanish in the face of something so profound. So yeah, it fits into the model I'm working with. I just sent a copy of my book to Stan the other day because I wanted him to see how he integrated some of his thinking into my model.
Uh-huh.
And any approach to expanding consciousness, I think, can be very helpful. Why? Because our consciousness is limited only by fear and defense, puts blinders on us so that we can't see what's beyond.
Okay, yeah, that's the integration right there. You just said it. Anything that expands, say it again, that expands our consciousness allows us to be aware of the limitations of the fears, I guess, that have been boxing us in.
Exactly. And again, that doesn't require some kind of mystical experience. We all know when we're in love or we have a powerful experience of community and affiliation with a group that our identity expands. We're not just this separate little scared or selfish, self-oriented, isolated individual. We're now part of something bigger and grander, and that can give a sense of purpose or meaning that can take care of all kinds of fears and problems in life. Yeah. The last section of my book is called Vision Questing because it talks about the power of having, George Bernard Shaw called it a mighty purpose. He said, this is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose considered by yourself as a mighty one. Yeah, so that is, again, an important remedy for anxiety because it puts us in this much more powerful and expanded spiritual context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, where are we then now? Because you've spoken about it so clearly, I'm not sure what to ask you, but there must be more things that you want to be able to say in the time that we have.
Well, you actually asked earlier about some of the exercises for remedying anxiety in the book. And I'm actually very, very proud. I hope that sounds okay, and excited to share these because they are highly effective. And their focus is, as we've been saying, to pinpoint precisely the moment where the chief defense or one of its spin-offs is applied, and we're reacting to a situation defensively in the most subtle or the most obvious way. And then in these exercises, we move through that defense to live through our fear in actuality or in imagination and discover it doesn't have the power to hurt us. So there are the, quote, big three exercises, I like to call them. One of them is affectionately known as the alchemist, the next as the witness, and finally the warrior's stance.
Uh-huh.
I was working with someone a while back who said, you ought to give these fun names so people feel like they're part of a club that's working on these exercises together, he said. The alchemist, so named because it's intended to transform a base experience, fear, into something higher and finer, involves, and I always hesitate to give a brief description because, again, it requires training and finesse to do the exercise effectively. But it involves looking, like we did with the core fear exercise, at some problem, any problem, and asking not those three questions, but a variant. What happens next? So sometimes it's helpful to ask your client to visualize their fear on a movie screen and describe to the therapist what they're seeing on the movie screen about the next moment in this unfolding movie of their fear come true. What is happening now, and now, and now? And there's a way to speed the process up by inviting them to imagine that they've been sitting in this scene. Well, I'll back up a moment. Of course, that process is going to bring them to the scene of their core fear. What happens next is similar to what are you afraid will happen next, or what are you afraid you'll miss or lose? And it brings you to the scene of your core fear. That's when the magic can begin, because staying in the scene of your core fear and continuing to ask what happens next, just living through it in imagination without the defense, which would make one say, well, let me change the subject, or let me distract myself, or let me find a quick fix. Mm-hmm. The therapist's job is to instruct the client, stay with this process all the way. So as I was saying, you can speed it up by asking them to imagine sitting in that scene of their core fear for a full hour and let them sit with that. Then imagine sitting in it for 3 hours and 6 hours and 12 hours. And you keep expanding the time intervals through a day, a week, a month, a year, a century, a millennium, and ultimately millions and perhaps billions of years.
Yeah.
When you fantasize this, there is a powerful adaptation that occurs. This moves us past the resistance that usually otherwise has us stop short of a complete confrontation with our fear. And in stopping short, we keep the fear alive and say, yep, I really did have to defend against it. I really did have to put my mind on something else because this is truly scary. But living through it in imagination all the way without any defensiveness at all always leaves one feeling completely free of the fear. I'm telling you, it's the most powerful tool I've ever discovered for resolving anxiety. And if activated appropriately, it seems to work virtually every time.
Wow, that's wonderful. It's putting me in mind of other psychotherapeutic approaches that rely a lot on imagination. And in particular, I'm thinking of psychosynthesis. I don't know if you're aware of that. That came out of some other imaginative approaches too. And they'll have people, for example, taking two sides of a conflict up to the top of a mountain and letting the sun shine on it. So that's all happening in imagination, yeah, reportedly with dramatic effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a whole range of therapies that involve the imagination, from guided imagery, of course, to imaginal exposure. And I think that their success depends, again, on how thoroughly they remove the use of the chief defense or the resistance, and create a full and complete exposure to the not any fear, but the core fear. There
Yeah.
is, I would say, a danger in not in creating exposures to something other than the core fear. I had a client once who had severe social anxiety, and he was brave. He had been working with someone who told him, get yourself in that car when your work colleagues say, let's go to lunch and tough it out and this and that. Well, he would do that over and over and over, and he wasn't getting any improvement. What we understood when we went through the core fear process was that there was still a chief defense operating in the form of, as soon as I'm done this car ride, I'm going back into hiding.
Yeah. Right.
You don't really capture the core fear and chief defense and know that that's what we have to address, you're not going to have any resolution.
What was the core defense in that situation, if you remember?
I do. This guy had quite the story. At 1 year, I'll give you a little background before I answer. At 1 year old, he had an older brother and was, of course, living with his two parents, but his father kidnapped the older brother in the middle of the night. His word is kidnapped, and they were never heard from again. The mother was very anxious herself and continually put into my patient's ear, oh, you got to worry now. What if your father comes and kidnaps you as well?
Mm-hmm.
And so her anxiety left him feeling quite unprotected, and he had to learn how to try. Well, first of all, his core fear was of, let me see how he phrased it. When we use the 5 categories, they're just sort of general markers, but it's important to help a client phrase it in their own way. His was definitely a core fear of abandonment, but his way of describing it was that I'm unsafe and alone in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So his chief defense was to try and be his own parent and not rely on anybody else, not trust anyone else. And there it is again, all defenses backfire. In not trusting anyone else, he was trying to prevent this terrible rejection and abandonment he was so afraid of. He actually reinforced it by saying, there's no one out there for me to trust. And a lot of our therapy was about helping him get past that with me as his therapist, that I was the first person he felt he could trust.
Yeah. I'm just amazed at how all therapies have so many of these elements, right? There's like nothing that you're saying is unfamiliar. There are pieces of it all over the place, from
Sure.
spiritual traditions to a whole variety of other therapeutic approaches. And I guess it's the alchemy of figuring out what's going to work and bringing it all to bear.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that. I like to say that everything I'm proposing in this deconstructing anxiety model is kind of intuitively obvious for a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes even for lay people, because the core fear process, for instance, asking what are you afraid will happen next, or why is that upsetting to you, and so forth, is really just a very precise way of analyzing what's at the root of the problem. So it's very psychodynamic. But if you know that you're looking for a core fear, a most fundamental level of explaining all of one's perceptions of difficulty and struggle, then that really changes the ball game. And I think that's why this approach can be so effective.
Yeah.
Other approaches certainly sometimes land on the core fear and chief defense.
Right.
Even something as seemingly straightforward and concrete as cognitive transformation. You can say, hey, this is an irrational belief based on catastrophizing. That might be enough to help a patient or a client realize my core fear is, my chief defense is catastrophizing to protect myself from this core fear of whatever it is they're catastrophizing about. If I think about it, if I catastrophize, I'm prepared, I'm ready to defend. So anything can work, But if it doesn't work, I propose it's because the core fear and chief defense haven't been adequately addressed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm remembering that I wanted to ask you about your role as a sports psychologist. That's an interesting piece of your story that we haven't gotten to here. And it must have, I don't know which came first, whether you brought all of this to sports psychology or if something you learned in sports psychology informed this.
I'll give you an interesting story. I was, along with my brother, a competitive figure skater in another life.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and my father, the psychiatrist, befriended our coaches, who were pretty high-level coaches. One of them was Scott Hamilton's coach. Scott and I had some acquaintance back then. And these were great people. My father wanted to get to know, so we were training at training camp in Lake Placid, New York, when my father took them out to get a beer or two and told them that he could do hypnosis for the athletes. And they were all over that.
Yeah.
So he became the team psychiatrist and started doing sports psychology. He was one of the first in the field. He published an article in an edited book that really kind of introduced the use of hypnosis and visualization as a sports psychology measure. And he met Michael Murphy at Esalen Institute, who was also at the vanguard of sports psychology and so forth. So I followed in his footsteps once again. Uh, and
Wow.
I combined my love for skating after I was no longer skating with what I do as a psychologist. It was a great, great experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you still doing that or not?
Every now and then, I dip my hand into working with some skaters at the local rink, which is the one I grew up in.
Wow. That's great. Everything comes full circle.
It does.
Yeah. Well, I think you've given us a great exposure to your book, to the ideas and your thinking, and that it's a great model because there's such specific direction. Um, you know where you need to go, right? You need to go
Yeah.
into the core fears areas. And
And the mind sure can get complex if we don't have that guiding compass.
yes, that's what I'm impressed by is there is a very good guiding compass here. And at least as you've presented it, it seems really clear, you know, stepwise, how to start going down the elephants.
There you go. The title for a next book, right?
Yeah, right, right. Um, so if, maybe we're going to wrap it up here. I wonder if you have any closing ideas that you want to make sure you get out there.
Sure. Just to emphasize, because again, I have such a passion about it, that with this clarity, and it's not so much about any new discoveries that I'm proposing, but a very clear system for deconstructing the root causes of anxiety and then moving through the defenses that preserve and exacerbate the anxiety. We truly can get a grip on everything that's been troubling us, a profound picture of what created our psychology, our personality, and how to relieve the suffering that can cause. We might end up enjoying the personality we've chosen, but at least it's a free choice now, not secretly or unconsciously driven by core fears and chief defenses.
Okay, well, Scott Pressman, I really want to thank you for being my guest today. It's been fun and enlightening.
My pleasure, and I'm not sure why. It must be something in another dimension, but people always call me Scott, and it's Todd.
Did I just said that?
It's so common that there's got to be a reason for it. I'm just not sure what it is.
Todd. I don't know where Scott came from.
No problem, Michael.
Thank you.
It was a
Okay.
pleasure, David. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you.